and start off. So yes, thank you everyone for being with us today. It's so lovely to see so many of us, gathered here for this event. For most of us, it's evening here in India and Pakistan, and we have people joining from US, from UK. So thank you so much for your time. I'll very briefly do a round of introductions and a couple of vote of thanks. And we'll take it from there. We have an exciting webinar lined up today. So we're part of Conservation Optimism, which is a movement to spread positive news, positive messaging, and inspire action for nature. And we believe, even though there's lots of issues when it comes to biodiversity conservation and nature in general, we truly believe, within these issues or within these realities of our world, there are really, really positive, inspiring stories that motivate us for action. And that's really the ethos with which we're part of this movement. And within Conservation Optimism, we have different hubs to sort of take the message of CO across the world and really, catalyze action on the ground as much as possible. So I'm Munib. I'm part of the India hub. I'm also a PhD student at the same time. And we have with us Bilal and his team, who's part of the Pakistan hub. And through this collaboration between India and the Pakistan hub, we have started this series called Bridging Borders. And really the idea behind the series is to have a common platform for researchers, conservationists, nature enthusiasts from across the two countries to share really, their experiences, expertise on different topics that might be different in the sense of, they might happen in two different countries, but they might have a lot more in common in terms of challenges, success stories, and things like that. So it's really a knowledge exchange platform, especially across these two countries that are our neighbors. So yeah, we had our first event talking more generally about opportunities to collaborate and bridging borders. And today, on the occasion of World Wetland Day, we thought it would be most appropriate to have with us two really, really interesting speakers who've done a lot of work around different aspects of wetland to speak to us today. But before I introduce them, I'd like to do a vote of thanks. Bilal, maybe do you want to unmute yourself and give a vote of thanks to some of the dignitaries that have allowed us to collaborate with students from Pakistan, and then I can introduce our speakers.
Yes, exactly. First of all, I like to thank Munib Bhai for arranging this and for the collaboration. Secondly, I want to thank University of Education Lahore, especially Dr. Manisha and Dr. Mudassir. Due to those collaboration, it was not possible for us to spread it to students as we have currently. So thank you so much, Dr. Mudassir and Dr. Professor Manisha Sahab. Maybe you can carry on from that.
Thank you, Bilal, and thank you, Dr. Mudassir and Dr. Manisha. It's great to be able to reach so many students. So with that, I won't really take much of your time, and I'm really excited to introduce two of our speakers today. We have with us Dr. Humaira Aisha from WWF Pakistan. She's a conservation manager, and she's worked on many different things. I think she's going to be speaking about coastal vulnerabilities and adaptation in the Indus Delta, sharing her experiences. They've been working on many different things, especially with people on the ground. So it's going to be very interesting to delve into that side of things. From India, we have Shivona, who is a PhD student in conservation science at the University of Minnesota, looking at different sort of opportunities and trade-offs for waterborne conservation in human-made wetlands. So I'm very excited because I think we'll get to hear not only two people talking about two different geographies, but also amalgamation of science and on-ground conservation. So I think it's going to be very exciting. Just in terms of housekeeping, we'll have Dr. Humaira speak to us first, and then we'll have Shivona speak to us roughly for about half an hour in total. They have a couple of presentations to share with us. Then we'll open the floor up for questions, discussions. So feel free to add in your questions in the chat and raise your hand if you have something pressing to speak about in the middle, and then we'll hope to facilitate that discussion. But before I hand over to Humaira to start, I'd love Dr. Mudassir to say a couple of words for everyone gathered here. Dr. Mudassir Saab, please, if you could just give us a couple of words. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Doctor, mute. Bilal, I think you might have to unmute Dr. Sir. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Munir. I am honored. I am feeling very honored to say a welcome note on behalf of my university, University of Education. The World Wetland is celebrated internationally each year on the 2nd of Feb. It makes the anniversary of the signing of Conservation of Wetlands of international importance at the Ramsar Convention on February 2, 1971. The most distinguished chief guest of the day, the conservation manager at WWF Pakistan, Ms. Hamira Aisha, and PhD scholar at University of Minnesota, Ms. Shivona Bhujwani. We are very welcome to both of our guest speakers. And I am also want to say to extend my welcome note towards our university and our students, and especially to Mr. Munib and Mr. Bilal, who are the basic organizers of this event. Thank you so much. And go ahead, please, Munib.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. With that, Hamera, please, I'd love to give the floor to you and please take over.
Thank you very much, Munib, and Conservation Optimism colleagues to have given me this opportunity to join this wonderful event today. So I'll just share my screen, so bear with me for a second. The computer is a bit old, but I hope it will work. Can you see it on a presentation mode now, my presentation?
It's still, yeah, now we can see the presentation, but it's not in presentation mode.
You can have it.
Not so
yes. Clear.
No, it's good. Yes.
Fine. It's okay.
Thank you. So thank you once again. And to the faculty members, to the students and all the researchers and experts who have joined today's celebration. I think that is the best way to celebrate an environmentally important day, to really learn and maybe highlight the work that we do, to also engage youth more into, just assessing the issues that these particular sites face and habitats face. So I'm sure the term wetland is not an unfamiliar one to anyone who is participating to this webinar. And we also understand that, why it's important to talk about wetlands, not just for the sake of having an ecosystem which is under pressure, but for having a type of ecosystem which is very important to the survival of our own selves. So wetlands in Pakistan, especially, I think we must know by now that Pakistan has over 200 wetlands and nearly 240 in total. And 19 of them are Ramsar sites. So Ramsar sites, as Dr. Mudassir also said, that it are those wetlands which carry immense ecological importance and are of international importance. So in Pakistan, of these 19 Ramsar sites that we have, I'll just be speaking about one of the wetlands. And instead of maybe just going more into the science, we'll try to see that why that particular wetland is important for our own human being, our own human species, and what is it that is being done to protect that wetland, but from a very human-centric approach, where people who are living in those areas are taking the responsibility for their protection. So I'm Humaira Aisha, as Munib has introduced me, not a doctor yet. And this has been 15 years for me this year that I'm working in the field of conservation in different capacities, and I've been able to work in different parts of Pakistan and wetlands are one of such habitats and ecosystems where I So this map basically represents the coastline of Pakistan, which is well over 1,000 kilometers in length. And while it's diverse and dynamic and including the exclusive economic zone and the territorial waters that we have, this coastline is extremely dynamic in terms of the ecosystem it hosts and also the people it supports in terms of livelihood and the type of ecosystem services it provides. So ecosystem services is basically a term that we use for all sort of benefits that we obtain from nature. And wetlands, for example, being water bodies, are very relevant and important aspects here to quote, because they provide us some very essential services in form of food. We get water from them. We also get the major source of oxygen. They are also carbon sinks. There are cultural services. There are ecosystem services which are linked to the tourism and so forth. So now the Indus Delta, if you are able to look at my screen, so there is again a zoomed in map of the Sindh region in Pakistan. And down there, what you could see is that in the Sindh, there is this picture of the Indus Delta. But while I'm trying to tell you Indus Delta, I'm assuming that all of us understand what deltas are in general and why are they wetlands. Deltas are basically, and for those students who haven't been to the south and they haven't seen the sea, I think it will be interesting to learn. So deltas are usually the places where your river enters into the sea or ends up into the sea or in estuarine areas and creeks. So usually, they are low-lying areas shaped at the mouth of a river, and the river basically terminates, and they basically takes many years to form, and they bring in a lot of basically fluvial and debris with them flow, which basically accumulates to that place, and that's where the delta forms, and which is why they are kind of unique habitats and ecosystem. And Pakistan is really blessed to have the Indus Delta, which is globally the fifth largest delta that exists. And it has 17 major creeks and several small creeks which also comes out of it again to the south. And Indus Delta basically ends up into the Arabian Sea. Now, mangroves is a forest, a very unique type of forest in Pakistan and all over the world, where it grows usually the places where you have the deltas, the dike ecosystem. So the mangrove forest in the Indus Delta in Pakistan has been ranked as the seventh largest in the Asia, and it is the third largest all over the world. And good news that you might have also heard recently that Pakistan's mangroves are amongst the few cases around the world where the mangroves are increasing. So, so now if I tell you the geographically, just for a quick glimpse, so Thatcha, Badin, those are the sites in Pakistan, where you basically, that's where, the delta has spread also in parts of Karachi also. Now, delta is also very important because it is linked to the life of over 1 million people who are linked to this delta for their lives, for their livelihood, or for something else. So the picture in the background that you could see is basically a mangrove tree. So now, in terms of how rich the deltas are in terms of what they host. So this is just like a quick glimpse to, what is deltas, biodiversity looks like. There are several species of commercially important fish, many other species which are important catch and they make part of your fisheries, several species of mammals, several species of cetaceans, large cetaceans, many species of local and migratory birds, and so much many more. But also, mangroves is just not one species. So Pakistan historically had 8 species of the mangroves, but as of today, the Indus Delta hosts 4 species of mangroves. And the most predominant of them is Avicennia marina, the gray mangroves, basically, which covers pretty much 90%, well over 90% of the entire Indus Delta. And that mangrove basically predominates in pretty much all parts of Sindh also. And then, to lesser extent, Rhizophora and then other species. So now, in Pakistan's context, and I think when I speak for Pakistan's context, Indus Delta could make a lot of relevance to many other deltas around the world when it comes to challenges, it comes to issues which they face. So the Indus Delta in Pakistan has been ranked as the third most vulnerable delta around the globe because of the challenges and problems it faces. When I say challenges and problems, it means that it doesn't have a lot of fresh water coming from the Indus River. There is a persistent issue of sea intrusion, land erosion. There is an overexploitation of the natural resources, primarily the mangroves and fisheries resources. There is also a challenge with the habitat degradation. Either it's the coastal habitat, it's the mangroves essential habitat, and then coupled with the anthropogenic pressures like climate change, pollution from all sources, and also the unplanned and unsustainable development, they all contribute to basically make the delta's vulnerability further worsen. And although, I mean, it is an essential life support system to many communities, several type of life forms, but still, it continues to stay as one of the most vulnerable delta. So now, why is it that people needs to be brought into the center of this discussion to see, well, we need to protect delta, but we also need people here to protect it. So one reason essentially is that people are the ones who rely on the delta's resources much more than anything else. And in a very human centered world, we try to protect everything because we have something linked to that, and every ecosystem, every species, they have their certain role to play, and those roles are often coming to us, our basically our support. So that is one of the reasons that people need to be brought into the center of the conservation of the wetlands, and Indus Delta is one of them. And then this also helps to make sure that when you try to bring in people, especially those who live into the closer areas, and people from all kinds and from all disciplines, this makes the conservation efforts more sustainable. You continue to get those benefits which are coming from those ecosystems. So for example, from delta, from Indus Delta, if people are catching fish, for the fish to be able to continue to support this life and livelihood, it is important that the delta is able to maintain all the ecosystem functions it has. So this is how basically you also link and bridge the gap between poverty alleviation and everything. And also when you bring in people into the conservation of the thing, and I think that's the work that I will be talking more about today, this also gives you an opportunity to bring things more sustainable, so that you are teaching a generation to protect, conserve, wisely use, so that it stays available for the next generation. And this is how you are able to basically raise that seed of conservation into people's soul. And they are doing conservation by nature, not by force or by any conservation initiative. So, and that is really important. So now here is a basic fact, and I just put them into the bullet forms because I thought it'll be interesting for you to also see that how does people life translate into the ecosystem services that we are gaining from the delta. Because Indus Delta and the communities, the people who've lived there, have traditionally been very close to the nature. And when I say close to nature, it means that their lives, their lifestyle, their culture, their tradition, and even their livelihood was so much is and still is linked to the nature. And it comes from traditionally from agriculture, fishing, and also, I mean, in many ways, they were also linked to the mangroves for their livelihood. Now, when the Indus Delta is becoming more and more vulnerable, so this nature-based lifestyle and nature-based dependent livelihoods are also, because deltas are also unfortunately the areas where you have the communities mostly living at the very marginal side of the lifestyle, and usually their income is really really low. And when you lose those essential services and important support which comes from the delta, either it's it's the fresh water, either it's the sediment flow, your lifestyle and your livelihood begin to be. And those are the people who may not be very privileged, like you and I, who are sitting in a room, have an access to computer. They lack, unfortunately, access to many basic resources such as water, healthcare facilities, education. Even most of the communities are off-grid. And with the pandemic having its impact really, spreading all over the world, they are also the people who are, getting impacted in the worst possible ways, because their nature-linked livelihood and the supply chain has impacted in a bad way. So this is just one way to picture, a wetland ecosystem really providing benefits to people, and what would happen if those essential services are gone. So this is very interesting study that we concluded in 2020, and we are going to publish it very shortly. So this study has basically focused on just going to people in the Indus Delta and asking them, what it is for you that climate change means, and how has your life changed over the course of many years? And is that something that you've been able to adapt to? and whatever is pasted here in front of you is not a science. It's basically actual traditional ecological knowledge. A fisherman, a person who's been engaged in the agriculture before, a woman who is going to fetch water from 4 kilometers away, has responded to this. And what is really important here to see is that, if you look at the percentages and the responses, that people have begun to talk about, what have they lost when the delta has become vulnerable due to many challenges it faces. They are losing their agriculture-based livelihood. They're also facing a lack of the major fish catch, which is, maybe part of their major livelihood, and overexploitation and not having a good ecosystem quality could be one of the reasons. And then there are also those people who don't even have access to basic healthcare facilities. So, and those are the people, if they would lose anything, they might, and they are the people who are also losing their houses to the sea. So as the sea is, gradually increasing, they keep on losing land. And there is a point that many of them would just have to leave from there. So again, this is one way to look at how ecological benefits translated into people's lives, and how their absence could make a difference to people's lives, especially the ones who are very close to it. So which is why when we talk about managing deltas, or well, not delta, just the wetlands, we try to bring in quite a comprehensive approach, because in the Indus Delta, there are people who are sitting at the very front line of, where they face all the coastal disasters, all the cyclones. So whatever approach we try to bring into the picture to support communities and to engage communities in, it's really important to consider that risk of, facing the disasters. It has to be something which is very inclusive, which brings people very close to the decision makers, the institutions who are responsible to the nature conservation, and also the organizations and researchers who are working very closely to that. And the approach also integrates the really essence of, what people are suffering from. Either it's not having access to livelihood, either people losing their livelihood, and also, how do we really support, encouraging, and also, make people really contribute to sustainable management and utilization. And which is, in simple terms, really mean is that, how do you use something that it stays available for the future generation? But at the same time, we also need to talk about and really bring into the context that how do we also address the gender differences which exist, because gender difference is something which is very prevalent in our culture. But for communities who are living at really marginalized site, often these differences are quite pronounced, and the level of vulnerability changes between the people of all genders. So this is something which we call is an integrated approach for the protection management of the wetlands. And I'll just put together a couple of also example in front of you that we have been using in Pakistan, just to reflect on, when you research, when you try to come up with examples and contribute to your work, you keep in mind to, where your work can supplement the best. So this has been a few few of the examples which has been put into the pictures of into the wetlands management, but in particularly in the Indus Delta's context. So the first one is basically focuses on, how does the conservation approach and the management of deltas, or the management of the wetlands ecosystem, brings people who are from there, who are affecting the most and who has the biggest stake into the picture, but not just as a beneficiary, but empowering them, enabling them, supporting them to build their institutions and capacity so that they are able to be the steward of their own resources, so that they can protect and manage it. And once you have done that, you have those enabled community members who are now ready to take up the role of protect and also sustainably manage their wetlands. It could be in many forms. They can be working on alternate livelihoods. They can be working on the protection of forests, maybe, as a forest guard. They can be just working to eliminate the use of illegal nets, which is basically killing a lot more fish than it is required. Or they are the ones who are adapting, learning, and also helping their fellow community members to learn to those practices which can make their lives better. And also, where you also get the platforms to speak to, because we recently had the climate COP, and communities vulnerability was something which was brought over and again, but raising those voices from where it was required from the community level to take it to the point where it needs to be heard at the government level, the policy level is. And then the work that is being done on the wetlands conservation also integrates a lot of providing supplementary and alternate and other sources of people generating income, so that if their natural resources and livelihoods are gone, they know there are substitute means they can rely on and still continue maintaining their lives. So the first example is one of the ongoing initiatives that we are running in the Indus Delta, and it kinds of focuses on building strong networks of communities and helping them to organize as bigger community clusters, which is not only enabled, empowered, but they're also having the voices that that can be heard, and they can work together with the institutions like the Sindh Forest Department for the mangroves conservation, protection, and also their sustainability. And when initiatives like those could also be really, really helpful when you try to bring in alternates. So if people are cutting mangroves because there is no substitute for their livestock to graze, so then you offer these people such solutions and teach them how to adopt the solutions, which can provide them as an alternate. So if there is a lot of salty water and which does not allow you to grow more and more agriculture, but that is still tolerant to the fodder crops, why not it can't make a solution? Similarly, communities joining hand and raising nurseries with the forest department, engaging in the watch and ward, and also, there is a lot of good examples, and just this small initiative has been able to focus on 14,000 hectares of the area for the mangroves conservation and protection. And again, Indus Delta and Pakistan in general has set up a profound example of how, people and the governments working together could bring a lot of change in terms of the increase in the mangroves. Then some other examples, where, you need to bring in people, especially women, and making something essential, where they are able to also earn and learn, and being a more supportive contributor to the wetland management has been a very important aspect of wetlands management and conservation in Pakistan, and in particularly in Indus Delta. And what it does is that, women play an instrumental role in our agriculture dependent economies, in our fisheries dependent economies, and they also manage the entire household. But when it comes to setting the policies, and also when it comes to setting the conservation targets, often their role is over. But just empowering women and providing them what could support them to, like, really having access to basic amenities. So, for example, in the Indus Delta, there is a vast majority of community which relies on the rainwater. So the rainwater gets collected into those ponds, and women would have to walk for miles to get that water and come back to drink, or they would have to purchase it on a very expensive price. So now imagine in that community, when you work and you try to just help to dig a reservoir where the rainwater gets stored, could bring in a lot of change in their lives. Similarly, if they don't have healthcare access, which is a basic life support, but having an access through mobile medical camps could bring in a lot of change in their life. If a woman who's burning mangroves and facing a lot of exposure to the smoke every day, she gets a stove which has a better quality, this will improve her life, but also support to reduce pressure on the mangroves. So that's how you empower both people, communities, address those gender-specific issues, and also support to maintain the ecosystem. And then, of course, women get a lot of opportunities where they can be instrumental to support, besides just supporting in the fishing and agriculture. They can come up with something which is very unique and traditional to Europe, but it helps them to generate income and provide them the opportunity to sell their traditional products into the markets which might not have an easy accessibility source before. And then people, when they catch fish, a lot of fish, when they cut mangroves, it adds a lot of pressure. So you can't really stop people from cutting the resources or using it unless you provide them some substitute. So alternative livelihood has been a very interesting model that has been tried and tested in many countries. So if a fisherman or a person who's cutting a lot of mangroves or catching a lot of fish, you provide them with some facilities such as, small scale aquaculture, where they are just making their own ponds, raising crabs and small fish, which they are able to sell on an expensive price in the market with a better quality, would reduce, a lot of pressure. And there are examples where people have been not only able to adapt to them, but they've also, learned from that, and also, supported to build their capacity to adapt to that model, to support to establish a small scale supply chain. And again, when when women, and especially, and when people get their roles identified, when they understand what roles they could play to address the vulnerability, they get a better chance to support in the policy making. And one such example which exists for the Indus Delta are the local adaptation plan of actions, which basically are the local scale solutions driven from the communities to address the vulnerabilities of your wetlands, especially, the coastal areas in this delta. And this gets, become a part of your policies at the provincial level in Pakistan. And ultimately it contributes to the national, your NAPAs, and also, the contribution of the NDCs. But providing platforms to these communities where, they are able to support and speak for themselves is essential. So probably this is like a very relevant example in a different context, but people from these areas, especially from the wetland communities, unfortunately need a lot more support and handholding. So when we empower them, when we work with them, when we support them, we also must remember that there is a long way to go while we celebrate our small successes on the conservation, what needs to be done. So just improving their well-being and their basic life support sometimes helps these people to improve their conservation, to sustain a contribution to sustainable management of the naturals. So I'll stop here, and I hope I was able to give you some idea of, how wetlands conservation inclusion of community works. And those pictures are basically from the Indus Delta again, and you could see communities are basically planting. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Amira, for that wonderful presentation. I mean, it was just so breathtaking to hear the range of work that you guys have been up to, and really true to the spirit of conservation optimism. I mean, it was so nice to know that mangroves are actually increasing in Pakistan, because, where I am currently in West India, we are facing huge crisis with decreasing mangrove numbers. So that was lovely to hear. And it was a really enlightening to hear the whole ecosystem services angle, the importance of local people, just the wonderful work on the ground, and, really identifying that when we talk about community, it's not just one homogeneous entity, right? There are so many different nuances, as you said, working with women because they might have a different role, and other sort of professions. So thank you so much for that enlightening talk. We'll wait for questions and discussions after we hear Shivona. So I'll hand over to Shivona. Please go ahead if you want to share your screen, and then, yeah, if there are any thoughts and questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But yeah, we'll look at later. Shivona, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, perfect. I'm really excited to be here today. And I think also it makes it even more special that this is a India-Pakistan collaboration. I think I'll just start off. I think Dr. Humera has given us enough of an introduction to wetlands, so I don't have that difficult work to do. So with that perfect background, I'll get into something that is not often talked about. My name is Shivona. I am from Pune. I study wildlife biology. I studied wildlife biology at the National Center for Biological Sciences. And now I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota. What really interests me is to understand, can agricultural wetlands in India support water birds and other wildlife eventually? But I'll get to why this is so special to me. So just a basic background, water birds are any of those species of birds that require wetlands at least at some stage of their life cycle. And there are lots of birds that do use wetlands, but these are entirely dependent or obligate. And they, as you can see with these different pictures, they have different requirements during nesting, during feeding, during breeding. So all of those conditions need to be met. Especially for long distance migrants that require wetlands along the way. So the green parts are where this northern pintail comes from, and it comes to parts of South Asia and especially India. And India sort of provides those full service hotels for species that come all the way. But natural wetlands have been lost at an alarming rate in India. And surprisingly, I mean, this picture is just to show that agriculture is one of the major drivers of wetland loss, not to say that these individual people are the ones that are doing it. It's just agriculture overall has led to a destruction of natural wetlands. But an interesting fact is that in India, there has been a 30% increase in human-made wetlands in the past 10 to 20 years. So, and most of these are rice fields. So in 2010, there was a paper that came out to see, can rice fields support water birds? And I have to say that rice fields are not so good for forest species. So, they really can't support all sorts of species, but they can support a set of wetlands. They can support water birds. And in these agricultural landscapes, so this is a very recent study that happened in Haryana, and they found that just having trees in the landscape, because we have so many trees, these like this is the Asian woolly neck or the woolly neck stork, and they're able to find nesting sites in these agricultural landscape due to the presence of some important trees. So here, even though Dalbergia and ficus, fig trees, are so little in the landscape, they're actually highly used by birds, which is in the white. Similarly, in Delhi, I just want you to focus on the fact that ponds cover only 0.5% of the area, but they have around 170 species of birds, which is the highest known for any urban landscape so far. And I also want you to focus on the right side. So the representative ponds are ponds on top, which look kind of like soup bowls. And then you have ponds at the bottom that still sort of have the characteristics of wetlands. And this study sort of showed the characteristics that allow birds to persist in these wetlands. So under some conditions, you can have birds. And I think that's what people are really interested in. But what I will talk to you about today is irrigation tanks that are within agricultural landscapes. And as you can see, here's the Cyrus crane. It's a vulnerable species. And it's not just the Cyrus crane, but there's lots of other species that these support. And even though this has been overlooked, other species of mammals also use these areas. So this is a picture of a jungle cat that had come to drink water at a wetland that I was at in central India. And we still don't know their full potential in maintaining connectivity between protected areas for mammals. So I'm just going to explain why irrigation tanks are really unique. So first of all, these are really old. There are some that date back to 7,000 years. There's some that date back that are as recent as, a few decades ago, but I'm referring to mostly the ones that are ancient. And how this works is, if you look at this image, the top has streams coming in. And this is mostly in peninsular India where rainfall is limited. And then there is a dike. And so then there is pooling. And then the remaining water, there are sluices for them to irrigate paddy fields. And this is a typical irrigation tank found in Sri Lanka, but it's not very different from what we find in India. And what is interesting is that earlier, a lot of the management of irrigation tanks was by kings and generally royalty that gave out rights to using the water from these wetlands, charging high fees. But after independence, sort of the responsibility of taking care of these wetlands went to local district administrations, and these can be considered what you call common property resources. So they're actually not just important for irrigation. Today, if you see them, they are multiple use community areas, important for irrigation, for fishing. People wash clothes. There's cattle grazing because of the rights that have been rightfully given to communities that are grazing on this land. So they actually provide a lot of services. And it is of interest to make sure that this continues to be something that occurs. So I think one of the issues that occurred in late 1947 was that large irrigation projects started, like dams and a lot of groundwater tapping. So the privatization of water resources, along with this lack of maintenance in these ponds, resulted in the fact that their ability to irrigate land reduced. And there was a lot of funding from the Asian Development Bank, World Bank, to improve the governance of these wetlands with community participation, such as repairing water acquisition and allocating and distributing water and things like that. But it still goes back to this stage. And the question to ask is, why is it that nobody wants to maintain tanks in a lot of India? So my region of interest, and there are a lot of people here today from Gondia, so I'm really excited, but this is where my PhD is going to be based in. So irrigation tanks in Gondia have been built in by the Gond kings, and they were built basically with the help of communities like the Kunbis that were good at engineering practices that allowed for water to be, embankments that were dikes and that allowed water to go across paddy fields. So just to orient, this is at the border of Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh, and Wainganga passes, the river Wainganga passes in the north. And just to show you, this is the southernmost range of the vulnerable species Sarus cranes, and it is surrounded by a network of protected areas, forested protected areas. So sometimes they have tigers that come to drink water at these wetlands, and there's a lot happening. So these wetlands are about less than 100 hectares, and they're called Maji Malgujari Talaus, which means post the Zamindari system after the British left. And as you can see, they host a lot of vegetation species. They look a lot like natural wetlands. So over time, they have had time to semi-naturalize. And so they host a range of sedges and grasses that are great food species. They have a lot of submerged vegetation that, provide sources of food, floating vegetation. And and then now we come to the problem species, which they call Besharam, where I work. And Ipomia carnea was introduced as an ornamental plant. And this is different from the other species because it is woody. So it soaks up a lot of water and it creates these dense covers. So only a few species can actually use these areas. So there are some programs to remove Ipomia as much as possible. And so I wanted to understand what influences birds in these wetlands. And like I spoke about wetland vegetation, I figured that that was a good place to start in 2015. Because wetland vegetation is supposed to be really important. It is a good indicator of water clarity, it improves water quality, and it would be sensitive to any, I would say, disturbances. When I say disturbances, it's just the fact that there could be something that influences its growth and its germination and growth. And so I did my master's here. And what you see on the left is like a typical irrigation tank. On the right is a lot of members from SEVA, which is the local, it's a local institution that works on conserving Cyrus cranes and working with farmers so that cranes are not poisoned and that they can go all the way from chick rearing to finally establishing their own territories. But I also realized that, it's for birds to persist here, there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of taking into account all the uses of wetlands. So the other thing that we noticed was that a lot of exotic species were being cultured, and these species replaced a lot of the, these have been promoted because they grow fast, but have replaced the local vegetation species. And now what has happened is a lot of the vegetation has gone away because these are voracious herbivores. They just eat up everything. And so now the cost for fisher folk has gone up because they're they have to make investments to restore vegetation. They have to make investments to stock these species. So it's not really profitable either. And submerged vegetation is really, as I said, really important. And we found that in ponds with the Indian major carps, they still tend to have submerged vegetation. If you look at the diagram to the left, the ones with Indian major carps still have submerged vegetation, but with exotic carps, the amount of submerged vegetation just goes down drastically. But if you look at the woody species, of course, fish aren't going to eat that. So that content that perhaps gives it an opportunity to grow and take over whatever vegetation helps birds persist. And there was also some indication that with increasing amount of submerged vegetation, fish harvest increases. Although this is a preliminary result, it was these findings of the links between human livelihoods and well-being and ecology that sort of helped me try to understand what is going on. So again, like digging was a very important activity that occurred to remove silt, but it reduced submerged vegetation, whereas it did not influence hypomia. And this has been observed even in, irrigation ponds in Bangalore, where they've, birds have reduced over 2 to 3 decades. And, the lakes used to be shallow basins, so they'd have a gradual slope, but now beautification programs cause concrete building and completely removing that gradation that is required. At least in central India, there have been some initiatives to improve participation, but the main sort of trade-off happens in water required for agriculture and water required for fishing. And I think those two generate a lot of complex politics in the area. And depending on who is in power at the Zilla Parishad, who is in power, what the rules are at the Gram Panchayat level, a lot of these are negotiated between people. So I started my PhD because I was interested in restoration, and I joined a restoration ecology lab. And I was really interested in this idea that, at an international level has been recognized as human well-being is closely tied with what biodiversity provides. And a lot of these benefits are mediated by how these wetlands are managed. So good quality of life, top box, bottom is biodiversity and ecosystems. And how those effects are felt in between is the complicated part. But that is the part that really needs understanding if these are to be sustainably used and equitably used. And so just to give you an idea of like the kinds of things that I'm grappling with just now. So earlier there were these really old sort of ideas that population increase is leading to the destruction of common property resources like these tanks. But actually under some circumstances, especially in irrigation, people are able to navigate complexities and continue the sustainable use of resources. Of course, there are issues of there are several issues with the framework of thinking that people in the local area alone can do it, because right now nothing is disconnected. Whatever happens at the global level influences the local level in terms of rice production, in terms of social media, in terms of, there's a lot of globalization. So there's things that could be happening that we are not looking at. Dr. Harini Nagendra's work in Bangalore has actually been a big influence in the way I think about things in Gondia. And right now, restoration over there, so this is Dr. Manish Rajankar, and this is Shalu Kole. And as Hamera mentioned in her presentation, that now earlier fishing cooperatives were run exclusively by men. And now restoration programs that are occurring are happening because women have an equal stake in the fisheries societies. So there are some things that are happening in the landscape. So a lot of the questions that some people have been bringing up is, can we look at this from an integrated framework? How do people value wetlands? And then how does that influence the way they manage it? And then what does that mean for human well-being? Now, if I'm interested in this socio-hydrology, I'm also interested in how do we also, is there even a chance to conserve water birds, or do we just leave it? I mean, are there true opportunities, or do we just leave it to chance, like they did in Bangalore? And so I've been following this work by, Katie Moon, and essentially, conservation opportunities can be looked at as things in the biophysical environment, in the political environment, in the social environment that allow for conservation of like activities to occur. So for example, in California, they have farmer programs where they flood the winter fields, and migratory species are allowed to stop over and then they go, and these compensations are paid by the government. So basically these are different realms that provide opportunities. Like in the Delhi case, biophysical would be the fact that there was vegetation in those ponds allowed them to persist. And our understanding of this in the context of climate change is absolutely it's absent. We don't know what that means for these wetlands. So one thing I've been grappling with is the and the way I've been thinking about it, and I would like this to be a collective thinking exercise, So one way to connect, there are all these beautiful diagrams of how to connect different things, but how do you actually connect them? Is there some connecting link? And I think with a lot of the reading that I've been doing is the wetland continuum concept. So if you can imagine, there is a range. There is a lot of water on the top left. You have a lot of water coming in from rain. And then you have a lot of water coming in from groundwater. So that is recharge. And then on the other hand, at the bottom right, you have drought, that is reduced meteorological drought, that is reduced atmospheric water and reduced discharge. And these sort of create templates for wetland ecology. And this was proposed long ago, this is not new per se. And this is sort of a conceptual diagram of what birds can persist in these. So we have this information that can help us design wetlands that support birds. So A framework, so this is my framework. A framework is just the way that I'm looking at the world. It is based on a lot of theories and a lot of work that has been done before. And so I'm using water regimes, these patterns of wetting and drying, to connect waterbird habitat suitability with wetland governance. So that is use of water under circumstances of climate variability and land use change. And these will occur in the context of something like a black swan event, like something that has a huge change. Black swan event can be the advent of social media. It could be COVID, So under these circumstances, what happens? And we're hoping, so my first objective of my PhD is to just look at the influence of water regimes and how they change with different, with climate variability. And how vulnerable are they to changes in water use versus climate variability. I'm using remote sensing for this. The second set is I study water regimes with respect to habitat suitability. And I have two amazing field staff that support me in Gondia and Bhandara, Kanhaiya Udapuri and Nunali Raut. And throughout COVID, they've been collecting bird data in 42 sites. And I think Kanhaiya is here today, but you can just say hi to everyone at some point when we discuss. But they've been making all the bird counts available on eBird. And right now, the district is very focused on improving Sarus crane habitats. But Sarus crane often use paddy fields, so they may not be necessarily the best indicators of wetland health. And it might also be that better wetland health can support more Sarus cranes. We just don't know this. And in 2020, I went, and with the help of this amazing citizen science group that hosted us a workshop for free, the district collector attended. And we spoke about what issues concern them as a group and me as a biologist and where we can meet halfway. And I think this workshop really helped me with conceptualizing this framework. And yeah, I think you should stay tuned because this is just the start. So with that, again, I just want to say to what extent. I really want to focus on the fact that this is not forcing conservation in a place that it does not belong in. This is to see, is it possible? And there is a huge focus on equity in this case.
Great. Thank you so much, Yvona. Do you mind unsharing your... Yeah, perfect. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for that talk. That was really, really enlightening. I mean, just the whole concept of, human nature relationships is something that you start questioning and, sort of start seeing the complexities. And when, you hear the case of wetlands, especially the way you spoke about it, the lot of different interactions of the history of the place, the different species, the whole continuum you spoke about. And it's so interesting to hear both you and Hamira from two different sort of geographical concepts. But if we see the complexities and the factors that lead to these complexities and decision-making, they're very, very similar across the place. So it's really, interesting to see that. I just wanted to tell everybody in the audience that we've just run about an hour, but if you can bear with us and if you'd like to hang on for another 15, 20 minutes, it'll be nice to discuss a few questions if you had any, or just thoughts, and then we can wrap up. So I really want to apologize for that. We'll just open the floor for questions. There was a couple in the chat, which I think, Hamira, you have already answered. I don't know if you wanted to say a couple of words about that while we see if there's other questions, or just so maybe because all the participants might have not seen. So I think the questions were around what kind of mammals might be there in the areas Hamira spoke about. And I think there was a question related to benthic research on the benthic community. So I don't know if you wanted to just summarize what you said, and we'll wait for the questions.
So much, Munib, and I think both questions were very interesting. So one was relevant to the carnivore species that have been recorded from the Indus Delta. So I've listed a couple of them, especially that we've been observing as part of the baseline studies, and those included fox, jackals, and also some small cat species. But the very interesting species that we have is the fishing cat. And I think that's also a common shared species for between India and Pakistan also. And that's an elusive species. And there was once a time when we thought that it might have gone from Pakistan. But as that's an important species, and it's elusive, but unfortunately, it gets affected a lot due to the conflict because people do not, when they understand the value, so usually they would kill it if it would prey on their small chickens or their small livestock. And unfortunately, this is also a very big victim of the poachers. So you'll see them, well, you won't be able to see them often in the field if you spend weeks, but you can see them easily selling in the market. So that's a thing. And also to Sanofar's question on the banthic community. So I think this is mainly stays an under-researched area, although there exist studies which are around on some zones, but definitely this is something which needs to be explored and look at further, just to see how does the change in ecology and a shift in the water flow is also impacting these communities composition within the delta and within the different type of ecosystem that it hosts.
Great. No, thanks, Samira, for sharing that with us, and thanks for those questions. Really interesting. I see, Maria, you have your hand raised, so maybe you first, and then Intizar sir will come to you after. Bilal, you might have to unmute Maria. Yeah, please go ahead. Oh, sorry. I'll just see if I can.
Yeah, hi.
Oh, there we go. Awesome.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm a conservationist based in Islamabad, Pakistan. And first, I'd like to say those were such lovely presentations. I had such a good time learning all about wetlands in India and in Pakistan. It's so amazing to see how similar everything is. And I also wanted to start this off by saying that we have a big win for wetlands today, because two islands near Karachi that were mangroves, they were under threat by development, and today, just a few hours ago, actually, they were declared as protected forests. So big win for conservation today. And second, I had some questions for Dr. Hamera. It was about when you spoke about an integrated approach to conservation with the communities involved. I wanted to ask, how did the locals respond to the alternatives that you gave them? Because quite often, due to generational beliefs and things that their grandfathers, forefathers have been doing before them, they're kind of not very open to new concepts. So is that something that you faced? And if so, how did you manage that?
Thank you for asking this question, Maria. In fact, this is a very interesting one that you've asked, because conservation initiatives are often considered as a gift-based approach, where you just decide something and you take to the field and you expect that communities would adopt that. So I think the beauty of having an integrated approach is really to look at the problem from the lens of a person who's facing it. And that is where I think the role of vulnerabilities and the preliminary assessments and the consultations with communities comes in really handy. And I think that has been a very instrumental part of the approach that we follow, that before trying any solution, we really try to make sure that we understand the situation, and also we realize that the solution that we are offered is going to be acceptable and adaptable. Because part of the reasons that people would adapt to an alternate to what they are already using, either it's a livelihood source, it's an energy source, it's a form of a lifestyle, would be if there is a real application engaged to that. Because you cannot make a fisherman adapt to something which would not yield him anything in terms of income generation sources. And similarly, in terms of the pressures on the mangroves, you can't expect a fisherman, a person, just to stop cutting mangroves on the basis of the fact, well, you need to conserve the mangroves, and which is why it's important to think through it. So I think that process has been really important part of the work that we do, and pretty much I think everybody who contributes. And the vulnerability assessments that I also mentioned has been a very important source for the communities and the wetland habitat in particular to see that, how adaptive communities are, because as the delta is decreasing because the sea is intruding now, people are really leaving their houses because first of all, there is less arable area. There is also less land in many, especially in Kharochan site of Indus Delta. But then some basic solution came out very handy. So I give you one example, and I hope I'm not taking a lot of time. So we started this initiative in the Indus Delta in the recent 3 years. So one thing that we did, and I mentioned it before, that was really to introduce the access to those water reservoirs. So we helped communities digging in those reservoirs so that they can have something to store the rainwater. And as an outcome to that, well, apparently there were communities who have migrated from that particular site because there was no drinkable water available, and they came back. So sometimes, when you just realize and understand the situation and the solution, it becomes really easy to connect the dot. And same is with the ecosystem. So you can't just tell a fisherman to don't fish in a way that it kills marine biodiversity and there is a lot of bycatch unless you have something for a fisherman to adapt in a way that it just increases the income that he earns out of it, not really comes to the cost of the thing. So I think that is one of the things that we try to bring in handy, but definitely I think there is still a lot more room where this can still be made such good success that it stays sustainable in a long run, so that not just the conservation initiatives but communities are able to do it on even after a project completes. So I hope this answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Humera.
I'm sorry, I have one more question.
Sure.
I'm so sorry. I hope I'm not taking so
ahead.
much time. For Dr. Humera again, I wanted to ask if cultural myths or folklore play into your conservation techniques, because it's quite often a big part of conservation is like handling the cultural beliefs and cultural myths that are behind certain animals. So I just wanted to ask if that's something you've dealt with or faced during your work.
Again, I think a very good question, Maria. So there are two aspects of it. One of them is basically a positive side that we call traditional ecological knowledge. And that is, where, the traditional knowledge passed on between the communities or people you work with from generation to generation. And sometimes this comes in so handy to find solutions to the problems, which may be a course conservation based project only based on science might not be able to achieve. So for example, what is sustainability in the language of a fisherman? What could be a good way to protect an area from fishing, from hunting? So sometimes that knowledge and information and, even that ecological information to, where for example, in terms of wildlife, where a species was once found and why it has, reduced to this, comes in very handy, and it has really strong role to play in the conservation and policy making, especially at the informed level. And that is one of the reasons that in the entire policy making process relevant to any discipline of conservation brings in this really important role of the community and their traditional knowledge that they could play. Now comes to the second side, which is more on the beliefs, which actually are not really supportive the conservation efforts. So for example, and one thing which would come again relevant is the illegal trade in wildlife, and especially the species which are linked to our wetlands. Migratory birds, for example, has been one of the major victims of poachers. Even the local birds, especially during this season, where you say many more animals, birds are just being picked up, and then certain species towards certain species, people have believed that their organs, their fat, their liver fat, and same applies to the freshwater turtles, and also many more such species, and most of them are from the wetland habitats, that they carry aphrodisiac properties or they can heal the problems, which are basically there are no scientific examples. So changing those beliefs, I think, is one of the challenges that we face across the conservation ladders of many different approaches that we follow. But I think a perception change and a behavior change is something which is going to come maybe a little bit later than we expect. But I think having more awareness, engagement, and people having access to more and more that sort of material information And platforms like Conservation Optimism coming forward and bringing in examples could bring in to like really support to discourage that trend at the citizen level. With the community level, I think a behavior change, more specific site aspects can really support to change myths and beliefs around, what exists towards towards the nature and wildlife.
Great. No,
Thank you so much.
and thanks, Maria, for those wonderful questions. I mean, it really is such an important aspect to highlight, this whole grassroots way of both building knowledge, but also, engaging with people. Just before we go to the next question, I'd love for Shivona to just come in for a couple of minutes and also maybe highlight something, that she, as you alluded to, been working with people on the ground to generate that knowledge, both in terms of the work you're doing and also engaging with them. So it'd be lovely to hear your side, with respect to what Amira said as well. So,
Thanks, Munib. So I think there's different kinds of knowledge. There is this knowledge that comes from people who are actually dependent on the wetlands for their day-to-day existence. And then there is this knowledge of people who are really interested in birds. And then there is this knowledge about how to manage it at a very administrative level. So I think in terms of communities, we haven't started this round of interviews yet, but the reason I interviewed fishers during my master's was because they were the most tied to the ecology in terms of their livelihood. So fish harvests were directly dependent on what happens at the wetland level. And I think in terms of just, it feels, I think unless you're going to use, I just want to caution that unless we're going to use that knowledge to communicate it to the same people, I think I have to be really clear about why these interviews are happening and what we're going to do with them, because you don't want to make, as an external agency, often you don't want to either make false promises. And number two, I think what is happening is because fishing in itself is a dying art, a lot of that knowledge seems to be eroding. And a lot of people who are fishers actually have to take 3 jobs to sustain as a fisher. So, there's like there are some pretty clear things about that knowledge being there and then that knowledge sort of slowly disappearing. I have to say that in terms of birds, some of the folks on field they know when a Saris crane is like in a 2-kilometer radius. And I'm still like asking where, and a lot of I learn a lot from them. So local can be very different things.
yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's just fascinating to hear those perspectives. And it's really important, a lesson for us to remember that, to be very cognizant of what we do, what expectations we might set, and to communicate appropriately to the people we're working with. I'm very cognizant of time, but if people can bear with me, we will take 2 last questions very quickly from Mr. Intizar Sohail first, and then Dr. Mudassir. So Sohail sir, if you can hear us, please go ahead. Yeah.
My question again is to Dr. Humaira. Since you mentioned the fishing cat, I just wanted to know whether they did some camera tracking. And if yes, how frequently they got this fishing cat in the captures?
Thank you for asking this question. Yes, so the camera trapping work is something which is a continuous part of the work that we do. And we did got some images, and then there are some research institutes in Pakistan which are basically dedicatedly conducting the projects on fishing cat. In fact, the year before, we recovered 2 specimens of fishing cats from the Indus Delta, and they were killed by communities. And then we also not just capture them on the camera trap, so we have an initiative focused on the poaching and illegal trade of wildlife in general. So fishing cat is something which is a common victim, as I said before. So we keep a track and a good record of, what is going on in terms of their market, and also seeing, how many of them are confiscated and how many of them are basically being, captured and safely released by the wildlife department. So I'll be happy to share with you maybe over the email, the information that we have, and probably we can take it from there for further discussion if that's interesting for you to learn.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Dr. Mudassir, if you have a question, please. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mudeep. I don't have any question, but I want to suggest a thing that a few years ago, we were able to see many migratory birds in Pakistan, but currently there are a very lower number of these migratory birds that were coming from different areas of Pakistan, especially Siberia. I would like to suggest people and required guidance is also required, especially to our young generation like students, to prohibit the method of hunting of wild animals, especially towards migratory birds who are coming from different areas of the world, so that we can protect them and we can also save them in our country. They can come again and again in our wetlands, because the wetlands are the basic areas or basic Ramsar sites in all over the world, especially in Pakistan. The Pakistan is the basic area that is covering many different countries, and the many different migratory birds are coming in our Pakistan. So I would like to recommend all the students and all the participants to prohibit the methods of hunting in our areas, especially in our Ramsar sites and wetlands. So please continue.
Thank you, Dr. Mudassir. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to see all the big migrations and how important these stopover sites can be. I was gonna suggest we maybe stop here, but I think there's one interesting question that we'll get to, and I see Humaira, your hand is up, and come to you as well. But just very quickly on this one, Khalil wanted to know how exotic plant species affect migratory avifauna habitat. I was wondering, Shivona, if you wanted to maybe give us 2 cents on that very quickly. Yeah. Oh, I think you're on mute. Bilal, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. You wanted me to comment about migratory habitat?
Sorry, I was just, yeah, there's a question specifically around exotic plant species, how they might affect migratory avifauna habitat, and you can also speak more generally as well, please.
Yeah, so I think that's actually a very pertinent question. And there is a network in India that is now dedicated to mapping invasive species, but aquatic species have sort of been left behind, apart from the ones that are found in cities like, Iconia, Crassipes, and, all the ones that really make a huge difference, like clog the rivers in cities, are mainly Iconia, and they have received more attention. At least in India, I think, at least where I work now, the University of Minnesota, and I think that this would help, is if we actually had experiments about, not just experiments, but even controlled areas to see what allows certain invasive species to persist and what that does for birds. So a preliminary result is that when there's like things like Iponia that are 3 feet tall and covering the area, only say skulking birds like bitterns and, things that climb on top like egrets or herons, any sort of perching piscivorous species can sit on top. And then you have like the skulking species, but it really, it wipes out anything to do with migratory species, migratory shorebirds and ducks. So people are trying to remove it, and we still haven't figured out effective ways to remove it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Shivona. Really shows you, the drastic impact of some of these interactions. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that. I think even though we're having a really, really interesting discussion, and I'd like to continue with it, I'm very cognizant that we've run almost 20 minutes over. And yeah, I'm sure we'll try to stay connected. And if Shivona and Humera are okay, maybe we can even share your email with the participants here, so I'm sure there's a lot of interesting discussions to be had, maybe even potential collaborations out there. Humera, I was cognizant that you had your hand up. Did you want to say something in particular, or yeah.
No, I think we can go ahead with the wrap up, but something that I wanted to say was very relevant to and linked to what Dr. Mudassir was saying. Since we have a lot of young lot sitting here, and it's really good to see their enthusiastic participation in it. So Dr. Mudassir has pointed out a very specific issue, which is especially a major issue in Pakistan, and I'm sure maybe in India would also be related to the wetland biodiversity, that is the poaching and illegal trade. And in Pakistan, fortunately, while there is a lot of awareness about the biodiversity conservation, we still struggle a lot towards controlling their illegal trade of the wildlife, which is coming from the wetland habitats. So we talked about migratory birds, we also talked about turtles, and there are many such species which are openly sold in the markets. And while we rely a lot on the government institutions and the wildlife departments to control that, a lot of responsibility still stays on our shoulders, because being the individuals who are purchasing those, being the individuals who are seeing this act to happen and not report or do anything, could bring in like a lot of issues. So I think we should all really realize our responsibilities as individuals and also as citizens to, as of, we should not be part of this. And also we should also encourage this, that we should report any such incidents to the wildlife department so that we can protect these biodiversity from really the problems that they are facing. So thank you.
Great, thanks for sharing that, Humera. I think that's a very wonderful note to sort of come to at this webinar, to be like, all of us have the capacity to do something, and as both your talks highlighted, these are very sort of interconnected habitats with humans. So there's a lot we can do, all the way from enjoying these wetlands to researching about them to working conservation. So just getting a sense of that has been really good today. So thank you so much, and I hope that we don't celebrate wetlands just on International Wetland Day, though that's a one for it. I hope we celebrate them throughout the year for years to come. So thank you again for both of you and for your time. Thank you, Professor Saab and Dr. Mohammed Saab from University of Education Lahore, and all the students and participants for joining us today. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I think we'll have the link to the whole webinar shared soon. So you can share with your networks and get more feedback, and we hope to do more Bridging Border webinars into the future. So with that, thank you very much, and have a lovely evening or afternoon wherever you are. Take care.
Thank you so much, Munib, and thank you everyone for coming.
Munib,
Thank
please
you.
extend the vote of thanks to Dr. Mohammed Mansha Sahab, please.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, Dr. Mohammed Mansha Sahab, absolutely. Thank you so much for allowing us to collaborate and being here today as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Mara. Thank you, Shivona. Thanks, Dr. Mudassir.
Thank you so much. Bye.